cognitive training in older adults, a systematic review and meta-analysis. Lon Gwynn and Karen Murphy, Griffith University, Glenda Andrews, Griffith University, and Menzies Health Institute, Queensland, Australia. There has been growing interest in enhancing cognition in older adulthood via computerized cognitive training, CCT, though there is controversy surrounding the efficacy of CCT in promoting improvements to functional everyday activities. As core executive functions, EF, cognitive flexibility, inhibition, working memory, are applicable to most aspects of daily living, CCT targeting these processes would likely promote gains on trained tasks, and potentially on similar untrained tasks, near transfer, and general cognitive performance, far transfer. We report 2 meta-analyses investigating the immediate, pre-test to post-test, and long-term efficacy, pre-test to follow-up, of CORIEF CCT in improving cognition among older adults. 64 studies, encompassing 3,594 participants, included an eligible CCT intervention targeting at least one CORIEF, e.g., working memory training, both immediate and long-term. Efficacy analyses revealed significant, large training effects for trained outcomes, and significant, small training effects for near transfer and far transfer outcomes. When comparing the same studies, effect sizes from immediate and long-term efficacy analyses were comparable, suggesting that CCT gains were maintained over time. Further analyses of immediate efficacy revealed significant, small training effects for performance on executive functioning, fluid intelligence, memory, and visual-spatial domains, but not for attention or processing speed. After adjusting for publication bias, the training effect for fluid intelligence was non-significant, whereas processing speed was significant. It is recommended that future studies employ adaptive multi-domain training, as these studies were shown to produce significant training effects at each transfer level. Overall, CORIEF CCT interventions show promise in promoting immediate and long-term improvements in cognitive performance among older adults. Public significance statement. This meta-analytic investigation suggests that cognitive training targeting multiple core executive functions, working memory, inhibition, cognitive flexibility, promotes cognitive enhancement in older adulthood. Improvements in cognitive performance are shown not only on trained tasks, but on many untrained tasks as well, near and far transfer, though these transfer effects are small and limited to select cognitive domains. These improvements in cognitive performance appear to be maintained over time. Keywords: cognitive training, executive functions, older adults, cognitive aging, meta-analysis. Supplemental materials: http://dx.doi.org/10.1037/goal0000196.sub. With the rapid global growth of the older population, higher rates of age-related cognitive decline and more severe pathological decline, such as mild cognitive impairment, MCI, and dementia, are anticipated. Approximately 50 million people currently suffer from dementia worldwide, and the World Health Organization, 2017, predicts that this number will increase threefold by 2050. This will impact aspects of everyday living such as quality of life, e.g., loss of autonomy for those suffering from cognitive decline and their carers, and economic spending at both individual and societal levels, e.g., increased individual and government spending on age-related health care and long-term aged care, Kendig, McDonald, and Piggott, 2016. Considering these projections for the aging population, there has been an urgent call for interventions which might delay or attenuate cognitive decline. In response, there has been a surge in the number of studies investigating the efficacy of cognitive interventions for older adults, computerized cognitive training, CCT, interventions in particular. CCT requires participants to frequently and repeatedly engage in cognitively challenging tasks targeting specific cognition type domains, e.g., working memory, attention, processing speed. Lon Gwynn and Karen Murphy, School of Applied Psychology, Griffith University, Glenda Andrews, School of Applied Psychology, Griffith University, and Menzies Health Institute, Queensland, Australia. This work was supported by the Australian Government Research Train ING Program Scholarship awarded to Lon Gwynn. Correspondence concerning this article should be addressed to Lon Gwynn, School of Applied Psychology, Griffith University, Gold Coast Campus, Southport, Queensland 4222, Australia. Email lon.gwynn3@griffithuni.edu.au. This document is copyrighted by the American Psychological Association or one of its allied publishers. This article is intended solely for the personal use of the individual user and is not to be disseminated broadly. Psychological Bulletin. Copyright 2019 American Psychological Association, 2019, Volume 1, Number 999, http://19/$2909/19/.12.007/1037/0000196. 1. On a technological device such as a computer or tablet. The value of cognitive training is rooted in the premise that frequent, repeat practice on a task improves performance on the same and similar tasks. Thorndike, 1906. Thus, if proficiency on these cognitive tasks predicts real-world abilities and success, and if that success is contingent upon cognitive abilities, then repeated practice on these tasks should improve both task outcomes and performance in everyday activities. Simons et al., 2016. The topic of controversy, however, is whether cognitive training interventions can indeed promote general learning and, in extension, enhance general cognitive functioning and real-world abilities. OEI and Patterson, 2014, or whether it merely induces task-specific learn-ing, a pattern of findings that Green and Baylier, 2008, term the curse of specificity. There has been mixed empirical evidence concerning the efficacy of cognitive training. Many researchers have found that CCT is effective in improving cognition among healthy older adults, e.g., Anguera et al., 2013, Heinzel et al., 2014, Karbach and Frey, 2009. It has also been suggested that implementing such interventions during the prodromal stage of MCI or dementia might prevent or delay the progress of pathological cognitive decline. Vermage, Clausen, Dotzenberg, and Kessel, 2016. However, findings from other studies suggest that, although CCT improves performance on trained tasks, these gains do not generalize or transfer to untrained tasks, e.g., Bell-Lander et al., 2017, Herring, Muehlman, Verkey, Varela, and Kliegel, 2017, Lang and Suss, 2015, Souders et al., 2017. Despite numerous investigations into the efficacy of CCT, there is still heated debate regarding whether CCT is effective in improving cognition, and which training conditions facilitate and produce the largest training and transfer effects. Meta-analyses are therefore extremely useful in this field of research, because they use statistical tests to synthesize information from many related studies, e.g., CCT studies, to address mixed empirical findings. Meta-analytic techniques also allow for the identification of moderating variables which can offer insight into whether any particular study characteristics or training conditions appear to be more effective in improving cognitive performance. Ironically, meta-analyses have also reported mixed findings regarding the generalizability of cognitive train-ing, e.g., O, Bushkuhl, Duncan, and Jaggi, 2016, O et al., 2015, Karbach and Verhagen, 2014, Melder-Lervag and Hume, 2013, 2016. However, some meta-analyses that have reported positive transfer to untrained tasks have received criticism regarding methodology. For a detailed discussion, see Melder-Lervag and Hume, 2016. The purpose of this meta-analytic investigation was to therefore build upon and improve the methodology of previous meta-analyses in order to shed light on the efficacy of CCT interventions in the older adult co-group. Lation, and identify potential study characteristics that appear to be effective in producing broad transfer effects. Elements of computerized cognitive training interventions. The typical CCT study implements a pre-test, intervention, post-test design, and includes at least one training condition and one control condition. An effective training or training effect is established where the trained group shows a significantly larger improvement on an outcome measure, better performance at post-test than at pre-test, compared to the control group. Schmiede, 2016. The efficacy of a particular CCT intervention is typically evaluated in terms of whether training effects were observed for A. Trained outcomes, B. Near transfer outcomes, untrained tasks similar to, but measuring the same construct as, the trained task, and C. Far transfer outcomes, tasks measuring a different cognitive construct. Haber, Sturluetti, Kotzebashev, and Farid, 2017, Karbach and Verhagen, 2014, Konen, Sturbach, and Karbach, 2016, Shipstead, Reddick, and Engel, 2010. Controversies and inconsistencies in findings within the CCT literature are likely due to differences between studies in design and methodology. Aspects that have differed across CCT interventions include characteristics pertaining to the intervention, such as the type of training administered, e.g., focal cognitive domains being trained, whether training is adaptive, whether training is process or strategy-based, and the training schedule, e.g., length of training sessions, total training duration, number of sessions administered per week. Variations of these characteristics can affect the outcome of a study. For example, adaptive training which continue ally adjusts task difficulty based on participants' performance level, has been reported to be more beneficial than non-adaptive training in terms of training gains and neural efficiency, e.g., Bremer et al., 2011, Bremer, Westerberg, and Bachman, 2012, Queenan et al., 2016. Characteristics pertaining to study design also affect study outcomes, such as type of control conditions included active, passive, or both. Participants in passive control conditions only take part in the testing phases of a study. Researchers who only include a passive condition risk overestimating training and transfer effects. As non-focal sources of improvement, e.g., expectancy, motivation. General cognitive stimulation, social interaction, cannot be controlled. Guy, Rock, Marillet, von Bastian, and Martin, 2016. In contrast, participants within active control conditions engage in activities or training that produces the same non-focal effects but does not target the focal cognitive domain of interest. Schmiedek, 2016. This type of control is preferred as it allows for a more accurate estimate of training and transfer effects. Other variable study design characteristics include training location, randomized tie-in, sample size, outcome measures, and researchers' operationalization of transfer distance. Transfer distance refers to the taxonomy describing similarities in the nature of and processes that underlie outcome measures compared to the trained tasks. Noah, Lupton, Schmiedek, and Lindenberger, 2009. The majority of training studies typically categorize outcome measures in terms of trained outcomes, or criterion tasks, near transfer outcomes, or far transfer outcomes. Though, this classification has been defined and implemented disparately across studies. For example, in terms of working memory training, some researchers define near transfer as untrained may assure strictly from the same trained domain, i.e., untrained work ing memory measures, e.g., Gorari and Lawler-Savage, 2017. Conan et al., 2016, Lee et al., 2008, whereas other researchers define near transfer as untrained measures tapping the same or similar cognitive processes to the trained domain, e.g., working memory and short-term memory, STM, measures, Varela, Cogretti, Rivoldi, and Deveni, 2010, Schweighofer, Fisher, and Buick. This document is copyrighted by the American Psychological Association or one of its allied publishers. This article is intended solely for the personal use of the individual user and is not to be disseminated broadly. Nguyen, Murphy, and Andrews. 2015. Such differences in classification of transfer tasks complicate the comparison of findings across studies. Point 1. While it is clear that there are numerous characteristics that vary across cognitive training studies, the ultimate goal of these interventions is to promote far transfer effects, that is, apply training gains to a broad range of untrained, everyday functional activities. With the various design characteristics used in the large number of cognitive training studies conducted to date, there is a clear need for studies that focus on synthesizing and summarizing findings across the literature, e.g., meta-analytic investigations. Informa tie-in from such studies would be valuable to cognitive aging researchers and provide guidance for future research regarding the optimal training conditions and study characteristics that are likely to produce large training and transfer effects. How does cognitive training work? It has long since been acknowledged that repeated practice on any task improves performance on that same task. However, there are many different accounts of the cognitive and neural mechanisms underlying this training effect, particularly throughout adult development. One explanation emphasizes that, by frequently practicing a cognitive task, one will become quicker and more accurate on that task as the underlying cognitive and neural processes become more automatic, allowing for more efficient processing, e.g., Jonita, 2004. Another account, more relevant to aging, implicates the brain's role in reorganizing neural resources. In their scaffolding theory of aging and cognition, Stack, Park, and Werder-Lorenz, 2009, posit that learning and skill acquisition promotes compensatory scaffolding in the aging brain, that is, the recruitment of additional neural circuitry to supplement, complement, or provide an alternative way to achieve a particular cognitive goal or task. This scaffolding occurs prominently within the prefrontal cortex. Specifically within the inferior, lateral, and rostral regions, and is an adaptive response to deficits within other areas of the brain, such as the ventral visual cortex, hippocampus, and more posterior regions. The authors suggest that training establishes scaffolds to enhance performance of tasks that were previously carried out inefficiently. However, they also acknowledge that, where older adults already rely on scaffolds, evidenced by overactivation of neural resources, training may help lower reliance on scaffolding, reduce activation in scaffold areas, and improve efficiency of honed networks. In their revised model, STACK-R, the authors additionally consider life course factors that serve to enhance or deplete neural resources, and incorporate the possibility that cognitive interventions may directly influence brain structure and function, Werder-Lorenz and Park, 2014. On a similar note, Lupton, Bachman, Lindenberger, Schaefer, and Schmidt, 2010, emphasized plasticity as a mechanism on Jolene training effects. In their framework of adult cognitive plasticity, the authors distinguish flexibility from plasticity, where flexibility denotes an individual's capacity to optimize performance using existing neural resources, and plasticity as the CAPAC-ITY for changes in flexibility. For plasticity to occur, there must be a prolonged supply-demand mismatch, that is, a discrepancy between functional supply, current range of flexibility, or current ability, and environmental demands, e.g., task difficulty. Thus, when learning a new task, there is an initial mismatch between functional supply and environmental demands. Through repeated practice, the supply gradually improves to meet the demands, and eventually when they are matched, cognitive performance remains stable as there is no room for further improvement. Although enhanced performance on trained tasks are well established, this does not necessarily imply enhancements in other cognitive functions and everyday abilities, e.g., Nowak et al., 2009, Simons et al., 2016. To address this matter, cognitive researchers typically assess performance on a variety of transfer tasks in addition to the training task to measure the extent to which the training improvements are generalizable. However, to date, relatively little is known about the mechanisms underlying transfer. Katz, Shaw, and Meyer, 2018, Lustig, Shaw, Seidler, and Werder-Lorenz, 2009, Wolf et al., 2018. One of the earliest doctrines of training and transfer stems from Thorndike, 1906, who proposed the identical elements theory, whereby improvements on one cognitive process transfers to an other only if the two cognitive processes share identical features. This foundational concept paved the way for modern frameworks of transfer, including Tompkins, 2013, 2016, primitive elements, PRIMS theory. The overarching premise of this theory posits that the learning of general cognitive skills is a byproduct of learning specific cognitive skills. Central to this framework are primitive information processing elements, the smallest possible building blocks of information, some of which are task-specific, while others are task-general. After repeated practice on a task, task-specific elements can be combined, which leads to more efficient task performance, whereas task-general elements can be reused for other tasks and skills. Thus, the PRIMS model predicts that FAR transfer can occur even if the knowledge and skills gained from training on a certain cognitive task or domain are not directly applicable to a different task or domain as task-general elements can be reused. In particular, Tompkins, 2013-2016, suggests that training programs which promote proactive over reactive strategies may more successfully produce FAR transfer. Whereas reactive strategies are driven by experimental stimuli, proactive strategies are driven by internal task-related processing or preparation. Using the Stroop task as an example, the reactive strategy involves waiting for the stimulus, attending to the whole stimulus, both word and ink color, then naming the ink color. The proactive strategy involves preparing for the upcoming stimulus, which consequently alters the default attending step and replaces it with a more efficient step which only focuses on the ink color, thereby reducing interference from the Stroop effect. The PRIMS model suggests that proactive strategies are more complex than reactive strategies in that they require additional processing elements to be learned. However, proactive strategies appear to be task-general, and the learning of such strategies likely promotes transfer. For a modeled simulation of the PRIMS model, see Tompkins, 2013. Building upon these premises, researchers have investigated the neural mechanisms underlying training and transfer. One highly influential account posited that transfer is more likely to occur. For example, 2 working memory training studies might find improvements to untrained working memory measures and measures closely related to working memory, such as short-term memory. Although both studies observed the same results, Study 1 might report that they found near transfer effects and far transfer effects, whereas Study 2 might only report finding near transfer effects. This document is copyrighted by the American Psychological Association or one of its allied publishers. This article is intended solely for the personal use of the individual user and is not to be disseminated broadly. Efficacy of Executive Functions Training 3. When the training and transfer tasks share related information processing components and engage similar neural circuitry, e.g., Jonita, 2004, Karbach and Prey, 2016, Lubden et al., 2010. Dahlin, Neely, Larson, Bachman, and Nyberg, 2008b, were the first to provide both behavioral and neuroimaging evidence to support this overlap principle of training and transfer. After train ing young adults on a working memory updating task, letter memory, for 5 weeks, the researchers found that the trained group, compared to the control group, demonstrated transfer to another updating task, NBAC, but not to a task requiring inhibitory control, Stroop task. Their imaging data indicated that, at pretest, only the letter memory and NDAC tasks shared overlapping striatal activation, whereas the Stroop task did not. Additionally, an increase in activation was observed in the same region for both updating tasks as a function of training. When conducting the same experiment among older adults, however, no transfer effects were observed. Their neuroimaging data showed no overlapping pretest striatal activation between training and transfer tasks, nor any common training-related neural changes from pretest to post-test. The authors concluded that a prerequisite for transfer is that the training and transfer tasks engage overlapping brain regions at pretest, and that the response to training neural changes in these regions is similar for both tasks. In other words, gains in cognitive performance are likely to transfer to other untrained tasks, only if training and transfer tasks activate and show the same patterns of alterations in the same brain regions. This notion has also been supported by recent training studies employing neuroimaging techniques. Heinzel et al., 2016, employed NDAC training in older adults, reporting significant, albeit limited, transfer to the Sternberg task, a different working memory task requiring updating and maintenance processes. They found overlapping bilateral frontoparietal activation in both training and transfer tasks at pretest, and a common training-related decrease in neural activity within the medial frontal gyrus and caudal superior frontal sulcus for both tasks. Interestingly, no striatal activation was reported in this study, which may explain the limited transfer effects observed, improvements in only 1 out of 4 conditions of the Sternberg task, similar to the findings of the older participants in the Dahlin et al. 2008b study. Salmonen, Kuhn, French, and Schubert, 2016, implemented a dual NDAC training program to assess near transfer to a similar, untrained updating task among young adults. Participants were assigned to one of 3 groups. The training group received dual NDAC training, verbal and visuospatial NDAC tasks, presented simultaneously. The active control group received single NDAC training, verbal and visuospatial NDAC tasks, presented consecutively, and the passive control group did not partake in any training activities. Although the authors found no significant transfer to the single updating transfer task, all groups showed similar improvement. Only the training group showed significant transfer to the dual updating transfer task. Their neuroimaging data revealed that all groups showed neural overlap between the training and transfer dual tasks within the frontoparietal network and striatum at pretest. However, at post-test, only the training group showed a reduction in overlapping activation within the frontal cortex between the training and transfer tasks. The authors suggest that this decrease in activity may have signified a more efficient use of relevant task processes. Additionally, compared to the 2 control groups who showed little or no change, the training group exhibited similar patterns of neural changes on the training and transfer dual tasks from pretest to post-test, specifically, decreased frontoparietal activation and increased striatal activation. As the training group only showed significant transfer on the dual NDAC task and not the single NDAC task, the authors suggested that, in addition to the prerequisites outlined by Dahlin et al. 2008b, the training and transfer tasks must also share very similar processes for transfer to occur. The case for training core executive functions. Executive functions, EF, refer to a group of top-down mental processes that are essential for performing everyday activities. Diamond, 2013. 3 core EFS are most often represented in the extant literature: working memory, WM, the ability to simultaneously hold and actively manipulate stimuli in mind before recalling the appropriate information; inhibition, the ability to suppress automatic responses or irrelevant stimuli; and cognitive flexibility, the ability to switch between multiple tasks, mental sets, or perspectives. Although these EFs are distinct constructs, they share underlying processes and are, therefore, not completely independent of one another. Carr et al., 2018, Miyake et al., 2000. To illustrate this point, Diamond, 2013, explains that, to know which stimuli to inhibit, task goals must be held and updated in WM, and to hold and update information in WM, irrelevant stimuli must be inhibited. Further, both inhibition and WM contribute to successful cognitive flexibility, such that switching between tasks is facilitated when irrelevant information is inhibited and relevant information or goals are maintained and updated in WM. For more recent findings regarding the constructive executive functions, see Carr et al., 2018, and Miyake and Friedman, 2012. These core EFS form the foundations for higher-order cognitive functions, e.g., planning, reasoning, problem-solving, decision-making, and are heavily reliant on the prefrontal cortex. Otero and Barker, 2014, the anterior cingulate cortex and dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, in particular, Goldstein, Nalieri, Princiota, and Otero, 2014. The prefrontal cortex, however, is particularly vulnerable to the aging process, being one of the first areas of the brain to deteriorate, Princiota, DeVries, and Goldstein, 2014. Distinct regions within the prefrontal cortex project to a variety of cortical regions via white matter pathways. However, these pathways weaken and become disconnected with increasing age. Yuan and Raz, 2014. The strength of these pathways has been related to performance on tasks of executive functioning, whereby poorer integrity of white matter pathways is associated with worse performance. Madden, Bennett, and Song, 2009. Accordingly, other cognitive processes reliant upon ES also show early decline. Reuter-Lorenz, Festini, and Jantz, 2016. Therefore, training ES should be beneficial in improving cognition among older adults by strengthening the pathways in and around the prefrontal cortex through mechanisms such as scaffolding, Park and Reuter-Lorenz, 2009, or plasticity, Lovejoy et al., 2010. Furthermore, core-EFS have been reported to be critical in the execution of a number of cognitive processes which are also dependent upon the prefrontal cortex. For instance, perspective memory, the ability to remember intentions and planned activities, is a process critical for functional independence in older adulthood, e.g., remembering to take medications, remember. ING to pay bills. Neuroimaging studies have implicated the anterior. This document is copyrighted by the American Psychological Association or one of its allied publishers. This article is intended solely for the personal use of the individual user and is not to be disseminated broadly. For Nguyen, Murphy, and Andrews. Prefrontal cortex in perspective memory performance, e.g., Simons, Shalving, Gilbert, Fritz, and Burgess, 2006. Additionally, behavioral studies have shown that ES, including working memory and cognitive flexibility, are critical in successful perspective memory performance, e.g., Kliegel, Martin, McDaniel, and Einstein, 2002, Martin, Kliegel, and McDaniel, 2003, Schnitzbahn, Stahl, Zaintel, Koller, and Kliegel, 2013. Based on the overlap principle discussed previously, training core-EFS is likely to promote transfer to other cognitive processes such as perspective memory, as they seemingly engage overlapping processing mechanisms and brain regions. As EFs are essential to almost all aspects of daily living, e.g., mental and physical health, public safety, occupational and marital success, Diamond, 2013, declines in these processes have measurable everyday consequences. For example, lower scores on EF tasks have been linked to poorer driving performance, Adrian. Postal, Mosinger, Rassel, and Charles, 2011, and poorer decision making, e.g., Brand, Reckner, Gravenhorst, and Beckera, 2007. There is clearly a strong case for cognitive training targeting core-EFS, as improving these processes would likely enhance multiple cognitive functions critical for functional independence in older adulthood. Multi-domain executive functions training. Thorndike, 1906. Posited that the most common and surest source of general improvement of a capacity is to train it in many particular connections, page 248. Applying this notion to CCT, multi-domain training, training multiple cognitive domains, should exercise a wide range of cognitive processes, activate a large network of neural circuitry, and improve multiple different skills, Guy et al., 2016. Thus, as aging is associated with declines in numerous cognitive domains, taking a multi-domain approach to cognitive training is therefore more likely to promote broader transfer than training a single cognitive domain alone. This notion has been supported by Binder et al., 2016, who trained older adults in either inhibition, visual motor functions, spatial navigation, or all three processes, comprising 3 single-domain and 1 multi-domain group. After training, the multi-domain group demonstrated an increase in visual motor function and spatial navigation, comparable to corresponding single-domain groups. However, only the multi-domain group demonstrated a significant gain in far transfer measures of attention as well. Despite the promise of multi-domain training, this type of intervention has received relatively little attention compared to single-domain training, WM training in particular, which has been the focus of many research studies, meta-analytic investigations, and reviews. The numerous meta-analyses that have examined WM training have produced varied outcomes, with some authors concluding that training WM promotes far transfer in young and older adults, O et al., 2015, Karbach and Verhagen, 2014, and even improvements to inattention in daily life among children and adults, Spencer Smith and Klingberg, 2015, whereas others have found negligible far transfer effects in a range of different populations, Melder-Lervac and Hume, 2013, 2016, Schweighofer et al. 2015. Thus, the purpose of the current study was not to reproduce yet another meta-analysis of WM training, but rather to examine all types of EF training, i.e., CCT interventions that have included at least one EF component, and to further investigate whether multi-domain EF training is more effective in promoting transfer. Effects compared to single-domain EF training interventions. These findings will lay the foundations for future research to empirically examine whether single-domain or multi-domain EF training promotes larger training and transfer effects in older adults. Previous syntheses of cognitive training research targeting older adults. There have been a variety of different cognitive training interventions designed to improve cognition in older adulthood. One of the most popular types of interventions concerns video game training. Numerous meta-analyses have investigated the efficacy of video game training in improving cognition, though mixed findings have been reported. Torrio, Rios, and Ballesteros, 2014, explored whether video game training enhanced cognition in older adults. These authors reported small but significant positive train-ing effects on cognitive outcomes, including speed, memory, attention, and overall cognitive functioning. In contrast, Sala, Tatley-Dill, and Govit, 2018, reported non-significant and negative effect sizes for video game training on older adults' cognitive performance. Similarly, Beatty et al., 2018, reported a non-significant negative overall effect size for action video game training on cognition for older adults. These authors suggested that, as action video games are tailored to the younger population, training of this type may be too challenging for older adults who, therefore, are not likely to benefit from action video game training. Findings from these meta-analytic studies suggest that training on some types of video games, e.g., action video games, might not be as effective in enhancing cognition in older adults compared to others, e.g., commercial brain training games. In line with this notion, a meta-analysis conducted by Tetlow and Edwards, 2017, reported that commercialized cognitive training programs promoted small to moderate transfer effects to numerous cognitive domains, including attention, processing speed, visuospatial memory, and self-reported measures of everyday functioning among older adults. The current study, however, did not focus solely on video game training, but examined all types of computerized cognitive interventions targeting core EFS, including video game training and general cognitive training. The efficacy of general cognitive training ING in healthy older adults has been examined by a number of recent meta-analyses. Karbach and Verhagen, 2014, examined the efficacy of EF training across 49 studies, though their meta-analysis did not include multi-domain interventions. Further, the studies included in their analyses were not limited to CCT training, and some studies were not training interventions, but rather one-off practice sessions. These authors reported significant EF effect sizes on trained, near transfer, and far transfer outcomes in favor of EF training. They also found no difference in effect sizes between WM training and other EF training interventions. It should be noted, however, that this meta-analysis has received criticism for A. Including studies with no control group, B. Not accounting for group differences at pre-test, baseline, and C. Inadequately addressing the differences in training effects between studies utilizing active versus passive control groups, Melby-Lervag and Hume, 2016. A recent meta-analysis conducted by Sala, Exeli, Samir, Gondo, and Govit, in PRESS, focusing on WM training in older. This document is copyrighted by the American Psychological Association or one of its allied publishers. This article is intended solely for the personal use of the individual user and is not to be disseminated broadly. Efficacy of Executive Functions Training 5. Adults reported significant, large training effects for trained tasks and small training effects for near transfer tasks. However, Signet-ICANN far transfer was only observed for studies comparing training effects with a passive control group. Far transfer effects for studies, including an active control group, were non-significant. Similarly, other WM training meta-analyses that have not specifically focused on older adults have reported similar findings, whereby far transfer effects are largely observed for studies, including positive control groups, compared to those including active controls, e.g., Melby-Lervag, Reddick, and Hume, 2016. Another meta-analysis, Lampet, Paula, and Valenzuela, 2014, examined the efficacy of CCT interventions across 52 studies, not limited to EF training, though multi-domain interventions were included. The results of their analyses indicated that CCT produced significant, small training effects for memory, processing, speed, working memory, visuospatial skills, and for all cognitive outcomes combined among healthy older adults. Transfer effects were not limited to studies, including a passive control group. Studies including active control groups demonstrated significant and larger transfer effects to verbal memory, nonverbal memory, WM, and visuospatial domains compared to studies including passive controls. However, studies including passive controls obtained significant training effects for processing speed and executive functions which were non-significant in studies including an active control group. It should be noted that the studies included in the Lampert et al. 2014 meta-analysis were restricted to randomized controlled trials. This likely eliminated numerous potential interventions as a large number of CCT studies implement pseudo-randomization methods in order to ensure that the intervention and control conditions are equivalent in terms of age, baseline intelligence, and cognitive status, factors which potentially influence the effect of cognitive training gains, e.g., Varela, Carbone, Pastor, DeBenny, and Peretti, 2017. Conclusions from these meta-analyses suggest that EF training and CCT training have the potential to produce small to moderate gains in cognitive performance among older adults. However, it is not sufficient to examine cognitive training efficacy immediately after training. It is also important to examine the durability of training effects to determine whether continued enrichment is necessary and when this should be provided to promote the main tenets of functional independence in older adulthood. Meta-analyses in this area of research should therefore not be limited to examining the immediate efficacy of cognitive training, but should also explore whether any improvements in cognitive performance as a function of training persists over time. Accordingly, this study included an analysis examining long-term efficacy of CCT. The current meta-analytic investigation. With the increasing interest in cognitive aging, the number of CCT studies continues to grow, warranting updated analyses that examine and incorporate more recent empirical evidence regarding the efficacy of CCT. The primary aim of this meta-analytic investigation was to investigate the immediate and long-term efficacy of CORE-EF CCT in improving cognitive performance among older adults. Specifically, it was of interest to examine whether EF training produced gains in near-transfer outcomes, untrained may assure similar to the trained task from the same construct, and far-transfer outcomes, measures from different constructs. Point 2. This study extended upon previous meta-analyses, Carbach and Verhagen, 2014, Lampert et al., 2014, by examining the efficacy of both single-domain and multi-domain CCT targeting EF, not limiting studies to randomized controlled trials, and addressing methodological shortcomings that have been identified previously, e.g., Melviller-Bag and Hume, 2016. This study also sought to explore whether any factors pertaining to the intervention or study design moderated the efficacy of CORE-EF CCT across the different levels of transfer. In particular, whether single-domain or multi-domain EF training produced larger training and transfer effects. Other factors pertaining to the intervention, training schedule, and study design were also considered as potential moderators. Findings from the moderator analyses will provide a guide for future studies regarding potential training conditions and study characteristics that promote broad transfer to untrained cognitive domains. Method. Procedures were conducted, and findings were reported in accordance with the Cochrane Handbook for Systematic Reviews of Interventions, Higgins and Green, 2011, and the Meta-Analysis Reporting Standards, MARS, APA Publications and Communica Science Board Working Group on Journal Article Reporting Standards, 2008. Eligibility criteria. Types of studies. Articles examining the effects of a cognitive training intervention were considered for inclusion. Articles that reported follow-up data only were also included if the original training study met all eligibility criteria. Studies must have been published in a peer-reviewed journal to ensure that the studies included in the analysis were of an adequate caliber. Studies must have comprised a pre-test, intervention, post-test design, and included at least one intervention and one appropriate control condition, active or passive. Cross-sectional studies and studies without control conditions were excluded from the analysis. An active control, AC, group was defined as any training condition that aimed to produce the same non-focal effects as the intervention condition, e.g., motivation, social contact, enjoyment, cognitive stimulation, but did not comprise the focal cognitive components being trained, i.e., ES. A passive control, PC, group was defined as one that did not engage in a cognitive program or cognitive activities, e.g., waitlist, watching lectures or videos without answering questions about content. Control groups comprising any physical training components were deemed inappropriate for this meta-analysis, as physical activity training has generally been implemented as a separate intervention in itself. Reviews and meta-analyses of physical activity training suggest that physical exercise can improve cognitive functioning, e.g., Barer, Erickson, and Lou Ambrose, 2013, Colcomb and Kramer, 2003. Therefore, including control groups with physical activity. To this classification of transfer distance was adopted in the meta-analysis conducted by Karbach and Verhagen, 2014, and was therefore implemented in the current meta-analysis to maintain consistency and allow for easy interpretation and comparison of findings. This document is copyrighted by the American Psychological Association or one of its allied publishers. This article is intended solely for the personal use of the individual user and is not to be disseminated broadly. Six and Wynn, Murphy, and Andrews. Components may confound the investigation for improvements in cognition as a result of cognitive training. Control conditions engaging in a simpler variation of the same cognitive training received by the training group, e.g., non-adaptive training, shorter training duration, were also excluded as both groups would have received the same domain EF training. Types of participants. Studies must have included healthy older adults, mean sample age 60 years, 0.3 studies comprising older adults with functional or neurological impairments, MCI, or diagnoses of dementia were excluded unless the study also includes intervention and control conditions comprising healthy older adults, in which case, only data for healthy older adults were examined. Samples comprising older adults with medical or phys-ical conditions, e.g., hypertension, insomnia, balance impairment, hearing impairment, were also excluded due to variability in cognitive performance within these populations, e.g., Hemaband. Chatil, 2013. Types of training. Training must have comprised a process-based CCT intervention targeting at least one of the three core ES, cognitive flexibility, inhibition, or WM. Specifically, trained participants must have repeatedly practiced tasks via engagement with a technological device such as a computer, tablet, gaming console, or mobile device. Video game training interventions exercising at least one core ES were also included. Studies utilize ING Pure Pencil and Paper cognitive training or a projector to administer stimuli as the main delivery method for the training were excluded. At least 3 sessions must have been included in the intervention time to ensure that participants had practiced on the training tasks. Point 4 further, the intervention must have had a relatively regular schedule, that is, participants should not have had the option to choose the duration and frequency of training sessions haphazardly. Throughout the intervention, point 5 studies too lenient regarding her. Insta training, i.e., did not have a regular schedule, were therefore excluded from the analysis. Interventions that combined cognitive training with physical exercise training, brain stimulation, or pharmacological components were excluded due to potential confound effects. Where a study included a cognitive training only condition in addition to other combined training conditions, e.g., cognitive training physical activity, only the pure cognitive training and control conditions were examined. As this meta-analytic investigation focused on examining the efficacy of CCT targeting core EFS, interventions only included cognitive training components and no other. Types of outcome measures. Only cognitive outcomes were examined in this meta-analysis. Non-cognitive measures were not included, e.g., subjective questionnaires, physical outcomes, neural outcomes, etc. Additionally, at least one untrained task must have been included as an outcome measure too. Examine the efficacy of cognitive training on cognition. Studies that examined trained outcomes only were excluded because while they yield conclusions about the magnitude of improvement on a task after repeated practice, they do not address cognitive transfer. Cognitive performance from pre to post-test was analyzed. In addition to long-term outcomes, pre-test to follow-up were available. Search methods for identification of studies. Electronic searches. 2 comprehensive searches were conducted by one of the authors on 2 separate occasions to ensure that all eligible studies were included in the review. The first search was completed on October 12, 2017, and the second search on January 7, 2018. Results from the searches were similar as the same search terms were applied to the same databases, 1,995 compared to 2,085. Differences in search results likely emerged from articles which were published after the time of the first search. Key search terms included cognitive training or cognitive intervention or computery, ed training or game training or executive function training or executive control training or multi-domain training and older adults or aging. The optimal set of key terms used to search each database was ComQt after running numerous different searches and refining keyword combinations. This procedure was carried out with the consultation of an academic librarian from the university. Databases searched include Scopus, ProQuest, ScienceDirect, Ovid, and PubMed. Searches were limited to articles reported in English, but not limited in terms of publication dates. 2 attitudinal studies were identified from Google Scholar Alerts after searching was completed. Searching other resources. Additional studies were identified by searching through other resources, such as reference books related to cognitive aging, and forward and backward searching through reference lists of relevant articles. Data collection and analysis. Selection of studies. Initial search results were screened for eligibility based upon the article title, abstract, and document type. Reviews in conference or presentation abstracts were excluded. The full text of each remaining article was then screened to be further assessed for eligibility. This screening process was conducted twice by one author after each search on 2 separate occasions. There were no discrepancies in the final set of eligible articles between the 2 searches. 2 new articles which were published after the first search had been conducted and were also included in the final set of studies. A random subset of articles was provided to a second independent reviewer who was involved in. 3 age cutoff varies across studies targeting older adults. Some studies include participants over 50 years of age, and some only include participants over 60 or 65 years. Thus, the criterion concerning age in the current study, i.e., mean sample age of at least 60 years, was specified to be inclusive of studies with samples including older adults in the 50-year range. This is in accordance with similar reviews and meta-analyses that have specified the same criterion in terms of participant age, e.g., Karbach and Verhagen, 2014, Lampert et al., 2014, Rangers, Van Houten, and Van Boxtel, 2013. For there is no definitive rule regarding how many sessions constitutes training. However, some researchers have acknowledged that training interventions should comprise a minimum number of 3 sessions, e.g., JD and Bushkuhl, 2014, von Basten and Oberauer, 2014. We therefore specified a minimum number of 3 training sessions for this criterion. 5 if participants within a single study completed different amounts of training, e.g., participant A opted to train for 1 hour, but participant B trained for 24 hours. Performance on outcome measures would be considerably variable, thereby producing unreliable findings pertaining to the efficacy of that particular intervention. This document is copyrighted by the American Psychological Association or one of its allied publishers. This article is intended solely for the personal use of the individual user and is not to be disseminated broadly. Efficacy of Executive Functions Training 7. Screening 50% of title and abstracts, and 50% of full-text articles. In accordance with the guideline outlined by Orwin and Bedia, 2009, there was excellent inter-rater reliability, 0.83. The 2 reviewers resolved all disagreements after discussing the basis for inclusion or exclusion of each study. The eligibility of the final set of studies included in the review were assessed and agreed upon by the 2 reviewers. There was some overlap of studies included in the current study and previous meta-analytic studies, 11 from Karbach and Verhagen, 2014, and 16 from Lampert et al., 2014. Data extraction and management. A comprehensive record of data and study characteristics were coded using an electronic data collection form. A second independent coder was assigned a subset, 50%, of eligible studies to code using the same electronic form. There was excellent inter-rater reliability, 0.86. All outcome measures from each study were categorized into their respective cognitive domains by the 2 independent reviewers. 100% agreement. The included studies employed measures from the following cognitive domains: cognitive flexibility, inhibition, WM, executive functioning, attention, fluid intelligence, language, memory, processing speed, and visuospatial ability. These domains were therefore examined in the meta-analyses. See Table 1 for additional information regarding cognitive domains and categorization of tasks. Outcome measures were also categorized by transfer distance, trained, near transfer, and far transfer. Comprehensive meta-analysis, 2014, version 3.3, CMA, Biostat, Englewood, New Jersey, was used to conduct the meta-analyses. Most studies reported change score data to examine whether there were any changes in cognitive performance as a function of training group. These data were entered into CMA, pre-test and post-test means and standard deviations, and sample size of training and control groups. The correlations between pre-test and post-test measures were not reported in any of the included studies. Thorin, Stein, Hedges, Higgins, and Rothstein, 2009, suggests that when the correlation value is unknown, relevant studies in the field can be used to identify a plausible range for the correlation. Sabri, Antfolk, Carlson, Salo, and Lane, 2017, recently conducted a meta-analysis examining pre-post correlations within WM training studies. These authors reported similar pre-post correlations for training groups are 0.66, AC groups are 0.65, and PC groups are 0.66. Similarly, a meta-analysis conducted by Lampert et al. 2014, examining CCT efficacy in healthy elderly, applied a pre-post correlation value of 0.60. In line with these meta-analyses, the current study imputed 0.60 as the pre-post correlation for all studies. Sensitivity analyses indicated that findings were robust to pre-post correlation values. See the sensitivity analyses section. Where required, raw data were converted, e.g., standard errors or confidence intervals to standard deviations, using formulas provided in the Cochrane Handbook, Higgins and Deeks, 2011. In cases where study characteristics were unclear or sufficient data were not available from the full-text article or supplementary materials, original authors were contacted to request additional information. 9 out of the 10 authors contacted provided ADDIE. Tidal data and/or clarification of methodology. Most studies employed a variety of tasks to measure cognitive performance. Multiple effect sizes were therefore extracted from each study. To correct for this, aggregate effect sizes were calculated for each individual study. Measures of training efficacy. Effect sizes were computed using Hedges G, which corrects for small sample sizes. A positive mean effect size indicated larger performance gains in the CCT condition compared to the control condition, whereas the opposite held for a negative effect size. In accordance with Cohen, 1988, an effect size of 0.2 was interpreted as a small effect, 0.5 as a moderate effect, and 0.8 as a large effect. Studies with non-standard designs. Similar to previous meta-analyses, e.g., Landon et al., 2014, where studies included both AC and PC groups, only data from AC groups were included. Including AC over PC groups provides more accurate effect size estimates for CCT efficacy, as AC groups control for non-focal. Training effects such as expectancy and social contact. Exceptions. Included AC groups which comprised a simpler variant of the intervention, as in Queenan et al., 2016, or AC groups which incorporated physical training components, as in Gajewski and Falkenstein, 2012, wherein only data from the PC group were. Table 1 definitions and examples of tasks for each cognitive domain included in review. Domain definition examples of tasks from included studies. Attention outcome measures tapping attention assess the ability to select specific information for further processing. Strauss, Sherman, and Screen, 2006. Oddball task, useful field of view. Attention network task fluid intelligence. Fluid intelligence is defined as the ability to reason quickly, think abstractly, and problem solve, independent of acquired knowledge. Heck, 2013. Raven standard/progressive matrices. Cattell Culture Fair Test Global EF Global Executive Functioning measures the ability to control behavior and adapt to changing environmental demands. Karbach and Craig, 2016. Wisconsin Card Sorting Task, Tower of Hanoi. Language proficiency refers to the degree of competency or capability in a given language. Farhadi, 1982. Nelson-Denny Reading Test. Memory is defined as the capacity to encode, store, and retrieve information or stimuli. Strauss et al., 2006. Memory for nonverbal stimuli. Corsi span, forwards. Face memory for verbal stimuli. Digit span, forwards. Hopkins Verbal Learning Test. Ray Auditory Verbal Learning Test. Processing speed refers to the time required to make a correct judgment about a stimulus. Owsley, 2013. Digit symbol, pattern comparison. Simple reaction time visuospatial ability. Visuospatial ability refers to the ability to identify and locate stimuli. Strauss et al., 2006. Mental rotation. Note: EF executive function. This document is copyrighted by the American Psychological Association or one of its allied publishers. This article is intended solely for the personal use of the individual user and is not to be disseminated broadly. 8. Gwynn, Murphy, and Andrews. Included. Sensitivity analyses were conducted to examine whether there were any differences in effect size estimates between the type of control groups included. See the sensitivity analyses section. Where studies included multiple intervention conditions, proved that the interventions were similar and trained the same cognitive domains, data were pooled to form one intervention group. Pooled data were calculated using the formula provided by the Cochrane Handbook, Higgins and Deeks, 2011. Conversely, some studies that included multiple intervention conditions were split into separate studies. Varela et al., 2014, trained 2 older adult age groups, young, old, and old. Both age groups comprised an intervention and control condition. Data from each age group were therefore treated as 2 separate studies. Additionally, 3 studies each included 2 eligible intervention conditions targeting different core EFS. Binder et al., 2016. Stepankova et al., 2014. Zajasilam-Parska and Trempola, 2016. Intervention conditions were not pooled for these studies. Instead, for each article, the 2 eligible intervention conditions were treated as 2 separate studies, e.g., Binder Study 1 multi-domain, Binder Study 2, Inhibition. These two independent comparisons were entered into CMA, and the sample size of the control condy time was split between both comparisons, Higgins, Deeks, and Altman, 2011. Lastly, for separate articles reported different outcome measures from the same participants and were therefore collated into one single study, Gajewski and Falkenstein, 2012, 2018, Cooper, Gajewski, Freed, and Falkenstein, 2017, Wildwall, Falkenstein, and Gajewski, 2012. See online supplementary materials for additional details regarding data extraction, pooling, splitting, and collating for all included studies. Assessment of bias and heterogeneity. Risk of bias was assessed individually for each study using the Cochrane risk of bias. Toole, Higgins et al., 2011. The sources of bias or domains were adapted to assess the methodology and design of a typical cognitive training study. These domains included A. Random sequence generation, B. Blinding of participants, C. Blinding of outcome assessment/assessor, D. Incomplete outcome data, E. Selective reporting, and F. Other bias. The allocation concealment domain from the original risk of bias tool was omitted as this source of bias was not described by any of the eligible studies. That is, no studies described D. The method used to conceal the allocation sequence in sufficient detail to determine whether intervention allocations could have been foreseen in advance of or during enrollment, Higgins, Altman, and Stern, 2011, page 9. Instead, emphasis was placed on blinding of participants and personnel to assess whether participants had knowledge of the intervention received. Summary assessments of risk of bias were evaluated with respect to important outcomes within each study. A rating of low, unclear, or high risk of bias was appraised for each source of bias. In each study, the summary rating for each study, high or low overall risk of bias, was evaluated on the basis of bias concerning blinding of participants and outcome assessors, sources B and C, respectively. These two sources of bias were identified as key domains in determining the summary risk of bias as participant or assessor knowledge of the intervention received may greatly affect performance during testing, thereby affecting a study's findings and overall conclusions. Thus, a study was considered to have a low risk of bias if the blinding domains were evaluated as low. Risk. A study was considered to have a high risk of bias if unclear risk was rated for both blinding domains or high risk was rated for either domain. Additionally, where at least 4 out of the 6 sources of bias were evaluated as high risk, the study was also considered to have a high risk of bias as numerous methodological flaws might also greatly affect the study's findings and outcomes. Risk of bias evaluations were undertaken by 2 independent reviewers. All risk of bias evaluations were congruent between the reviewers. Refer to the online supplementary materials for risk evaluations for each source of bias in all included studies. Publication bias refers to the issue that small and moderate-sized studies reporting significant findings or large effect sizes are more likely to be published than those obtaining low findings. Bornstein et al., 2009. Consequently, such bias within the literature likely inflates the perceived efficacy of an intervention in question. However, due to the heated controversy surrounding the efficacy of cognitive training, it is likely that this field of research encompasses a more representative sample of findings and effect sizes. Even so, publication bias was assessed for each analysis. The funnel plot was visually inspected for asymmetry, and Egger's test, Egger, Davy Smith, Schneider, and Minder, 1997, was reported to support these visual evaluations. Within the funnel plots, studies are plotted in terms of effect size, x-axis, by standard error, y-axis. Large studies or studies with high precision generally cluster around the mean effect size and appear toward the top of the graph, whereas smaller studies or studies with low precision tend to be spread out toward the bottom of the graph, forming the funnel pattern. Bornstein et al., 2009. Duval and Tweedy, 2000. Trim and fill analysis provides the best estimate of an unbiased effect size by imputing missing studies to generate a symmetrically distributed funnel plot. This effect size adjusted for bias was also reported when trim and fill analyses indicated potentially missing studies. Bornstein et al., 2009, suggests that, if the adjusted effect size remains largely unchanged, the impact of bias is trivial. Where the adjusted effect size shifts, but the key finding, i.e., the overall mean effect size, remains unchanged, this may reflect modest impact of bias. Lastly, where the adjusted effect size alters the key findings, this may reflect substantial impact of bias. Each analysis was screened for potential outliers by visual inspection of the forest plot. Study effect sizes that appeared to deviate from the overall pattern were further inspected to determine whether the inclusion of the deviating effect sizes substantially influenced the results. Influential studies were identified using the one study removed function on CMA, which which provides overall effect size estimates with each study removed. If the inclusion of a study made a considerable impact on the outcome of the overall mean effect size, i.e., altered the interpretation of the outcome by changing the size of the training effect, that study was excluded from the analysis. The Q statistic for heterogeneity was used to examine the variance among all study effect sizes, CARD, 2015. This statistic tests the assumption that all studies share a common effect size, where a significant Q-test indicates that the true effect size varies substantially from study to study, Borenstein et al., 2009. The I2 statistic was also reported to gauge the degree of heterogeneity between studies. I2 expresses the proportion of true or between study variance, as opposed to sampling error, or within study variance, to total variance, Deeks, Higgins, and Altman, 2011. This document is copyrighted by the American Psychological Association or one of its allied publishers. This article is intended solely for the personal use of the individual user and is not to be disseminated broadly. Efficacy of Executive Functions Training 9. Accordance with Higgins, Thompson, Deeks, and Altman, 2003, I2 was interpreted as follows: 25% low heterogeneity, 50% moderate heterogeneity, and 75% high heterogeneity. A higher degree of heterogeneity reflects a larger proportion of true variance that can potentially be explained by covariates through moderator analyses, Borenstein et al., 2009. Data synthesis. As many methodological aspects differ across cognitive training studies, e.g., study characteristics, training type, and intensity, the effect sizes underlying these studies are likely to differ. All meta-analyses were therefore based on the random effects models, which accounts for variation of the true effect across studies. The alpha level was set at 0.05 for all analyses. Bonferroni corrections were applied to any post-hoc analyses. Planned analyses. Immediate efficacy, pre-post. To examine the efficacy of CORI-CCT in improving cognitive performance, analyses were grouped and run by transfer distance, trained, near transfer, and far transfer. An overall effect size was computed for each transfer distance. Effect sizes were also computed for individual, near and far transfer, cognitive domains to investigate which domains were likely to improve as a function of CORI-CCT. Individual cognitive domains for trained outcomes were not examined due to the limited number of studies available in this analysis. Long-term efficacy, pre-test to follow-up. Long-term improvements in cognition were examined by running analyses comparing performance from pre-test to follow-up. All studies profit ING follow-up data, in original article or separate follow-up article, were included in these analyses. Overall effect sizes were computed for each transfer distance. Analyses were not conducted at the level of individual cognitive domains due to the limited number of studies available. Moderator analyses. Moderators of CCT efficacy were examined by means of meta-regression and subgroup analyses. Meta regression was only performed for the continuous moderator vari. Able age of mean sample. This analysis was not performed for any other continuous variable as the data were not normally distributed. See Melville-Lervaag and Hume, 2013. Normality was assessed using the Shapiro-Wilk statistic, which tests the null hypothesis that the population is normally distributed. A significant statistic indicates non-normality. Shapiro and Wilk, 1965 length of training session, W.90, P.001, total number of training sessions, W.83, P.001, total amount of time spent training, W.71, P.001, age of mean sample, W.98, P.291. Subgroups for non-normally distributed variables were therefore generated in a way that allowed for a relatively equal distribution of studies between each subgroup. Planned subgroup analyses were conducted for A. Type of training received, single domain/multi-domain, B. Whether training was adaptive, adaptive/non-adaptive, C. Training location, home/lab, D. Type of control. Condition included active/passive, E. Length of training session. Up to 30 minutes for over 30 minutes. F. Total number of training sessions, up to 12 sessions/over 12 sessions. G. Number of weeks spent training, less than 4 weeks/over 4 weeks. And H. Total amount of time spent training, up to 12 hours for over 12 hours. Moderator analyses were not reported for individual far transfer cognitive domains or long-term efficacy data, as the number of studies in each subgroup would have been disproportionate due to the small sample size of studies in each analysis. However, these analyses are provided in the online supplementary materials. Sensitivity analyses. Sensitivity analyses were conducted to determine whether findings were robust to the different assumptions and decisions made when conducting the meta-analyses. This type of analysis constitutes an informal test to evaluate whether the same conclusions can be drawn after using different methods or excluding certain studies. Bornstein et al., 2009, Deeks et al., 2011. Findings were therefore considered robust if the conclusion or interpretation of the analyses remained the same across different assumptions or methods. For instance, the overall mean effect size did not differ as a function of model type, fixed effects, small effect, G0.33, P.001, versus random effects, small effect, G0.34, P.001. Under both assumptions, the overall effect size remained small and significant, indicating that the findings were robust to the type of model used, due to the variety of study designs employing different control groups as data were entered for the most appropriate control group. From each study, which varied between AC and PC groups, a sensitivity analysis was run to examine whether the type of control condition, AC, PC, or mixed, affected the overall effect size estimate. The overall mean effect size remained small and significant, regardless of the type of control included. The final analyses were therefore not limited to studies examining a specific type of control group, but included a mix of the most appropriate control groups from each study, AC or PC. Analyses were conducted assuming different pre-post correlative values, R.00, R.60, and R.90. Irrespective of the imputed correlation value, the same conclusions were drawn for each level of transfer, i.e., significant large effects for trained outcomes and significant small effects for near and far transfer, indicating that outcomes were robust to the pre-post correlation value. A value of 0.60 was therefore imputed for each study in accordance with prior cognitive training meta-analyses, Landa et al., 2014, Savary et al., 2017. Lastly, sensitivity analyses were conducted with respect to risk of bias, comparing all studies, only low-risk studies, and only high-risk studies. The overall mean effect size remained small and significant, regardless of risk of bias. All studies were therefore included in the final analyses. Refer to Appendix A for summary results of all sensitivity analyses. Results. Description of studies. Search results. Figure 1 illustrates the study flow diagram for this review. From a total of 2,088 articles, 64 studies were included in the meta-analysis. Data from 61 studies were analyzed to examine immediate CCT efficacy, pre-test to post-test, and data from 16 studies were analyzed to examine long-term efficacy, pre-test to follow-up. Characteristics of included studies. The majority of CCT studies were conducted in Europe, 59%, followed by North America, 24%, Asia, 14%, then Australia, 3%. Refer to AP Appendix C and D for a summary of intervention details, study characteristics, and overall effect sizes for each study included in the quantitative review and meta-analyses. Participants. Excluding repeated samples from follow-up studies, the number of participants across the studies totaled 3,591 healthy older adults, 1,991 trained participants, and 1,600 controls. This document is copyrighted by the American Psychological Association or one of its allied publishers. This article is intended solely for the personal use of the individual user and is not to be disseminated broadly. Nguyen, Murphy, and Andrews. Participants. Most studies utilize screening tools to assess intact cognitive functioning, MMSE range 24 to 30, or MoCA range 22 to 30. The mean age of participants across the included studies was 69.32 years, SD 3.95, ranging from 53 to 95. 8 studies included participants younger than 60 years of age. Study conditions. The number of active and passive control groups were comparable across studies, 41% and 48%, respectively, with only a few studies including both types of control conditions, 11%. 5 different types of chorea CCT interventions were identified: cognitive flexibility training, 8%, inhibition training, 9%, WM training, 34%, multi-cognitive training, train IMG multiple cognitive domains, 23%, and video game training, 26%. Multi-cognitive training studies were separated from the video game training studies as having a gamified component may increase motivation and engagement, and thereby produce differ. Egg training and transfer effects, e.g., Boot et al., 2016. Due to the limited numbers of studies for some types of training, the main subgroup, moderator, analyses compared single-domain training, comprising cognitive flexibility, inhibition, and WM training, and multi-domain training, comprising multi-cognitive and video game training. Interventions. Total time spent training ranged from 2.08 hours to 100 hours, M17.38, SD 17.11. Interventions averaged 22.59 training sessions, SD 17.06, range 3 to 100, with session length ranging from 15 minutes to 90 minutes, M46.52, SD 20.26. Interventions spanned an average of 7.02 weeks, SD 4.68, range 1 to 27, and training schedules ranged from 1 to 7 sessions per week. The majority of training programs were adaptive in nature, 77%, rather than non-adaptive, 23%. More interventions took place in a laboratory, 67%, than at home, 33%. Study design. Most studies employed randomization methods, 65%, followed by pseudo-randomization methods, 24%, with no randomization methods being least common, 11%. 48% of studies were classified as having a high risk of bias and 52% as having a low risk of bias. Correlations were examined to evaluate collinearity between the moderator variables concerning study and design characteristics. All moderators were found to be independent of one another. All intercorrelations between moderator variables were below the sub-just 0.90 cutoff value for multicollinearity. Card, 2015. Cohen, West, and Aiken, 2003. See Appendix E for intercorrela. Tie-ins of regression coefficients between all moderator variables. Computed using CMA. Follow-up studies. 16 studies were included in the analysis examining long-term efficacy of Coriac CCT. Of these studies, 3 comprised WM training, 3 cognitive flexibility training, 4 multi-cognitive training, and 6 video game training. Follow-up length ranged from 3 weeks to 18 months, month 6.83, SD 5.09. These studies included a total of 1,060 participants. 585 participated in a training condition and 475 in a control condition. Figure 1. Flowchart summarizing study screening and selection process. This document is copyrighted by the American Psychological Association or one of its allied publishers. This article is intended solely for the personal use of the individual user and is not to be disseminated broadly. Efficacy of Executive Functions Training 11. Efficacy of Coriac CCT interventions. Immediate efficacy, pre-test to post-test. Table 2 presents an overview of summary and moderator effect sizes for all outcomes, including overall and individual cognitive domains concerning immediate efficacy of Coriac CCT. Trained outcomes. Performance on trained outcomes was X. Means in 24 studies, see Figure 2. Between these studies, there was a total of 678 trained participants, sample size 28.25 SD. 21.09, and 514 control participants, sample size 21.42 SD. 13.14. Most studies in this analysis employed WM training, 15. Out of 24. There was a significant, large mean effect size in favor of CCT for trained outcomes, G1.00, 95% CI, 0.79, 1.20 P. 0.001. Significant, moderate heterogeneity was evident between studies, Q, 23, 58.52, P.001, I260.7%. The funnel plot displayed no substantial asymmetry, confirmed by Eggers test. 1.97, SD 1.32, P.148. The trim and fill analysis imputed 5 studies with negative effect sizes of low precision in favor of no training effect, and the adjusted effect size was smaller than the observed effect size, suggested 0.83, 95% CI, 0.61, 1.05. Although there was a drop in the effect size adjusted for bias, the key finding, i.e., overall size of the training effect, did not change. According to Bornstein et al., 2009, this may reflect modest impact of publication bias. There were no significant moderators for trained outcomes. The effect sizes were comparable across all moderator variables and subgroups. This indicates that, regardless of intervention or study characteristic, participants who had received repeated training on a task performed better on that same task than those who had not. Moderator analyses for this outcome were therefore not reported. Here, but a summary of these statistics is presented in Table 2 and in the online supplementary materials, Table S1. The online supplementary materials also provides the dataset and presents additional analyses and figures not reported in this article. Near transfer outcomes. Overall, a near transfer outcome was included in 55 studies, encompassing 1,782 participants in a training group, sample size 32.40, SD 34.15, and 1,509 participants in a control group. Sample size 27.44, SD 32.65. A small, significant mean effect size was observed in favor of CCT for near transfer out. Comes G0.26, 95% CI, 0.17, 0.34, P.001, with marginally. Table 2. Summary and moderator effect sizes for immediate efficacy, pre-test to post-test, of Coryet CCT across all outcomes. Groups/subgroups. Outcomes. Trained near, overall, far, overall, attention. Executive. Functioning fluid. Intelligence memory, speed, visual-spatial ability. Summary effect size 1.00, 24, 0.26, 55, 0.22, 57, 0.11, 24, 0.18, 38, 0.13, 33, 0.22, 16, 0.18, 22, 0.37, 5. Training type. Single domain 1.08, 20, 0.32, 28, 0.13, 31, 0.06, 13, 0.16, 25, 0.11, 22, 0.04, 4, 0.17, 13, 0.12, 1. Multi-domain 0.66, 4, 0.21, 27, 0.29, 26, 0.18, 11, 0.19, 13, 0.16, 11, 0.27, 12, 0.26, 9, 0.40, 4. Flexibility 0.77, 3, 0.33, 3, 0.09, 5, 0.02, 3, 0.18, 4, 0.01, 3, 0.01, 2, 0.22, 2. Inhibition 0.88, 2, 0.11, 4, 0.24, 6, 0.29, 5, 0.10, 6, 0.48, 3, 0.10, 2, 0.05, 2, 0.12, 1. Working memory 1.17, 15, 0.37, 21. Significant, low heterogeneity between studies, Q, 54, 68.52, P.058, I 231.19%, refer to Table 2. Table 2 and Figure 3. Although a clear outlier was identified, Borrella et al., 2014, Young Gold, Study 1.74, the one-study removed analysis revealed that the omission of this study did not substantially impact the overall effect size estimate. From study removed 0.23. A sensitivity analysis also indicated that the exclusion of this study did not impact the findings for any subgroup analyses of near transfer outcomes. See Appendix B. The funnel plot was visually symmetrical, confirmed by Ager's test, 0.64, SE 0.43, P.144. No studies were imputed in the trim and fill analysis. Moderator analyses were conducted to further examine the variance of effect sizes between studies for near transfer outcomes. The subgroup analysis revealed that type of training did not moderate the efficacy of Coryet CCT, Q1, 1.66, P.198. As significant effect sizes were produced by both single-domain training, K28, G0.32, 95% CI, 0.19, 0.46, P. 0.001, and multi-domain training studies, K27, G0.21, 95%. CI 0.11, 0.31, P.001, an exploratory analysis was conducted to examine whether any specific training types were most effective. The exploratory analyses indicated that only WM training, K21, G0.37, 95% CI, 0.20, 0.55, P.001, multi-cognitive training, K13, G0.15, 95% CI, 0.04, 0.26, P.009, and video game training studies, K14, G0.27, 95% CI, 0.13, 0.41, P.001, produced significant effect sizes after von Karony corrections were applied, 0.05/5.01. See Figure 3 for the effect sizes of near transfer outcomes stratified by type of training. The efficacy of CORIEF CCT on near transfer outcomes was not moderated by training location, Q1 0.29, P.591, or control type, Q1 1.16, P.282. Training adaptiveness was not a significant moderator, Q1 1.39, P.239. However, only adaptive training produced a significant effect size, K47, G0.27, 95% CI, 0.19, 0.36, P.001. Non-adaptive training did not yield a significant effect size, K8, G0.13, 95% CI, 0.08, 0.35, P.224. Similarly, no training schedule characteristics moderated CCT efficacy for near transfer outcomes. Length of training session, Q1 0.00, P.995. Total number of training sessions, Q1 0.15, P.694. Total weeks of training, Q1 1.35, P.246. Or total time spent training, Q1 0.58, P.446. All subgroups within these analyses yielded significant and comparable effect sizes. Refer to Table 2. Further, there was no significant association between mean sample age and training efficacy, 0.02, Q1, 2.60, P.107. Cognitive flexibility. Of the studies including a near transfer outcome, 12 measured cognitive flexibility. A significant, small training effect was obtained for untrained cognitive flexibility outcomes, G0.16, 95% CI, 0.02, 0.31, P.031, as shown in Table S2. Exploratory analyses indicated that no types of training produced significant training effects for untrained cognitive flex. Ability outcomes after von Karony corrections were applied, 0.05/3.017 cognitive flexibility training, K3, G0.33, 95% CI, 0.01, 0.67, P.056, multi-cognitive training, K1, G0.20, 95% CI, 0.30, 0.69, P.434, video game training, K8, G0.12, 95% CI, 0.06, 0.29, P.202. Inhibitory control. 13 studies assessed inhibitory control as a near transfer outcome. The analysis revealed a small, significant mean effect size for inhibitory control outcomes, K13, G0.13, 95% CI, 0.01, 0.28, P.048. Exploratory analyses indicated that no training types produced a significant training effect. Inhibition training, K4, G0.15, 95% CI, 0.04, 0.44, P.099. Multi-cognitive training, K4, G0.14, 95% CI, 0.11, 0.39, P.271. Video games training, K5, G0.11, 95% CI, 0.13, 0.35, P.354. Memory. In total, 45 studies included a near transfer memory outcome, assessing WM or STM. These studies produced a significant, small training effect, K45, G0.29, 95% CI, 0.19. Figure 2. Forest plot displaying individual and summary effect size estimates for trained outcomes. This document is copyrighted by the American Psychological Association or one of its allied publishers. This article is intended solely for the personal use of the individual user and is not to be disseminated broadly. Efficacy of Executive Functions Training 13. Figure 3. Forest plot displaying individual and summary effect size estimates for near transfer outcomes. Stratified by training type. This document is copyrighted by the American Psychological Association or one of its allied publishers. This article is intended solely for the personal use of the individual user and is not to be disseminated broadly. 14 Wynn, Murphy, and Andrews. 0.39, p.001. Exploratory analyses indicated that WM training, K21, G0.37, 95% CI, 0.20, 0.55, p.001, and video game training, K13, G0.36, 95% CI, 0.22, 0.50, p.001, produced a significant training effect for near transfer memory outcomes, even after von Ferroni corrections applied, 0.05/3.017, whereas multi-cognitive training did not. K11, G0.11, 95% CI, 0.09, 0.30, p.278. Refer to Table S2 for additional statistics regarding this analysis. FAR transfer outcomes. Overall, at least one FAR transfer outcome was assessed by 57 studies, 6 encompassing 1,896 participants in a training group, sample size 33.26, SD 33.71, and 1,534 in a control group, M26.91, SD 32.16. No influential studies were detected or removed from the analysis. There was a significant, small training effect for FAR transfer outcomes overall, G0.22, 95% CI, 0.15, 0.29, p.001, see Figure 4 for a forest plot depicting overall. FAR transfer effect sizes. Heterogeneity between studies was non-significant, Q, 56, 46.92, p.801, I2 0%. Egger's test indicated no significant asymmetry within the funnel plot, 0.23, SE 0.36, p.525, though the trim and fill analysis imputed 16 studies with positive effect sizes of low and high precision in favor of CCT, suggested 0.33, 95% CI, 0.26, 0.40. Although there was an increase in the effect size adjusted for bias, the size of the training effect was left unchanged, suggesting modest impact of publication bias. Figure 4 illustrates the effect sizes of FAR transfer outcomes stratified by training type. Subgroup analyses revealed that type of training moderated the training effect, Q1, 4.56, p.033, indicating that multi-domain training studies produced a larger training effect, K26, G0.29, 95% CI, 0.20, 0.37, p.001, than single-domain training, K31, G0.13, 95% CI, 0.03, 0.24, p.013. An exploratory analysis indicated that significant training effects were only obtained for multi-cognitive, K14G. 0.27, 95% CI, 0.16, 0.39, p.001, and video game training studies, K12, G0.30, 95% CI, 0.16, 0.45, p.001, after von Ferroni corrections were applied, 0.05/5.01. Also refer to Table 2 for all subgroup effect sizes. Training adaptiveness did not moderate the training effect, Q1, 0.09, p.766, though studies that employed adaptive training produced a significant effect size, K47, G0.23, 95% CI, 0.15, 0.30, p.001, while in studies employing non-adaptive training the effect approached significance, K10, G0.20, 95% CI, 0.01, 0.38, p.056. Training location was not a signified camp moderator, Q1, 0.29, p.593, nor was type of control group, Q1, 0.04, p.852. No training schedule characteristics moderated the training E effect. Length of training session, Q1, 2.44, p.119, number of training sessions, Q1, 0.08, p.782, total weeks of training, Q1, 0.60, p.438, total time spent training, Q1, 0.50, p.479. However, there was a significant positive association B. Tween mean sample age and training efficacy, 0.02, Q1, 4.90, p.027, indicating that studies comprising older Cardsci PAMs demonstrated larger training improvements. Attention. 24 studies included a FAR transfer measure of attention. In total, these studies included 690 trained participants, sample size 28.75, SD 17.35, and 526 control participants, sample size 21.92, SD 15.28. The analysis revealed a small, non-significant mean effect size for attention outcomes, G0.11, 95% CI, 0.04, 0.27, p.155, with significant, low heterogeneity. Neity between studies, Q, 23, 38.18, p.024, I2 39.76%. The funnel plot was considerably asymmetrical, confirmed by Ager's test, 2.63, SE 0.90, p.008, and the trim and fill analysis, which imputed 7 additional studies with negative effect sizes, suggested 0.05, 95% CI, 0.22, 0.12. The adjusted mean effect size was non-significant but negative, indicating larger improvements for control groups compared to trained groups on attention outcomes. Executive functioning. FAR transfer measures of executive functioning were assessed in 38 studies encompassing 1,303 intervention participants, sample size 34.30, ST 38.68, and 1,077 control participants, sample size 28.34, ST 38.59. These FAR transfer outcomes included tasks which measured global executive functioning or different EFs to those which were trained, e.g., WM training completing an inhibition measure. There was a small, significant mean effect size for executive functioning. Outcomes in favor of CCT, G0.18, 95% CI, 0.09, 0.26, p. 0.001. Heterogeneity between studies was non-significant, Q, 37, 28.62, p.837, I2 0%. The included studies were distributed symmetrically across the funnel plot, 0.25, SE 0.38, p.515. However, 5 studies with positive effect sizes were imputed to adjust for potential publication bias, suggested 0.21, 95% CI, 0.14, 0.29. The effect size adjusted for bias remained largely unchanged, reflecting trivial impact of publication bias. Of these 38 studies, 18 included measures of global executive functioning, producing a small, significant training effect, G0.20, 95% CI, 0.10, 0.31, p.001. Exploratory analyses indicated that no types of training produced a significant training effect after Bonferroni corrections were applied. 0.05/3.017 WM training, K2, G0.15, 95% CI, 0.23, 0.54, p.438, multi-cognitive training, K6, G0.26, 95% CI, 0.01, 0.53, p.060, video game training, K4, G0.19, 95% CI, 0.06, 0.44, p.134. For all statistics concerning subgroup analyses. For each EF outcome, refer to Table S5. The studies assessing cognitive flexibility as a FAR transfer outcome yielded a non-significant training effect, K12, G0.04, 95% CI, 0.10, 0.19, p.561. No types of training were effective in promoting improvements on FAR transfer cognitive flexibility measures, all PS.117. Similarly, the studies assessed ING inhibitory control as a FAR transfer measure did not obtain a significant training effect, K14, G0.13, 95% CI, 0.02, 0.27, p.092. No types of training produced significant training effects on these inhibition outcomes, all PS.067. 12 studies included a FAR transfer outcome assessing work ING memory. A small, significant training effect was obtained, G0.23, 95% CI, 0.01, 0.45, p.038, though no types of training produced improvements on FAR transfer working memory measures, all PS.132. In sum, FAR transfer to executive functioning was observed primarily on global EF and WM tasks. Fluid intelligence. FAR transfer measures of fluid intelligence were assessed by 33 studies comprising 1,103 intervention partake icons, sample size 33.42, SD 21.84, and 811 control partake. 6 note that this overall FAR transfer analysis aggregates numerous measures from different cognitive domains which vary in distance from the trained domains, e.g., attention may share a higher degree of overlap with EF than fluid intelligence. Findings from this overall analysis should therefore be interpreted with caution. The analyses concerning individual cognitive domains provide more informative details regarding FAR transfer. This document is copyrighted by the American Psychological Association or one of its allied publishers. This article is intended solely for the personal use of the individual user and is not to be disseminated broadly. Efficacy of Executive Functions Training 15. Figure 4. Forest plot displaying individual and summary effect size estimates for overall FAR transfer outcomes. Stratified by training type. This document is copyrighted by the American Psychological Association or one of its allied publishers. This article is intended solely for the personal use of the individual user and is not to be disseminated broadly. 16 Wynn, Murphy, and Andrews. Items, sample size 24.58, SD 14.23. The analysis revealed a small but significant mean effect size in favor of CCT, G0.13, 90. 95% CI, 0.04, 0.22, P.005, and no significant heterogeneity between studies, Q, 32, 31.55, P.489, I20%. Although Egger's test indicated no substantial asymmetry, 0.84, SE 0.73, P.257, the trim and fill analysis imputed 7 studies with negative effect sizes of low precision to balance out the funnel plot. Notably, the mean effect size for fluid intelligence outcomes adjusted for potential publication bias was non-significant, suggested 0.05, 95% CI, 0.06, 0.15. This reflects substantial impact of publication bias as the key findings change became non-significant when adjusting for publication bias. Language. The planned analysis was not conducted for this domain as only one study employed a FAR transfer language may assure. Memory. A total of 16 studies included a FAR transfer measure of memory beyond working memory. The studies in this analysis did not include pure WM training as working memory and STM. Share characteristics with WM. This analysis encompassed 683 intervention participants, sample size 42.69, SD 56.59, and 634 control participants, sample size 39.63, SD 56.30. There was a significant, small training effect for verbal and nonverbal memory combined, G0.22, 95% CI, 0.08, 0.36, P.002. The heterogeneity between studies was non-significant, Q, 15, 18.84, P.178, I224.39%. Both effect sizes for verbal and nonverbal memory were similar. For nonverbal memory, the mean effect size was small and significant, K7, G0.31, 95% CI, 0.07, 0.55, P.011, with non-significant heterogeneity between studies, Q, 6, 7.02, P.319, I214.58%. Similarly, for verbal memory, the mean effect size was small and significant, K12, G0.20, 95% CI, 0.04, 0.36, P.013, with non-significant heterogeneity between studies, Q, 11, 15.68, P.154, I229.83%. The funnel plot for overall memory displayed asymmetry toward the right of the mean, though Egger's test was non-significant. ICANT 0.13, SE 0.68, P.852. The trim and fill analysis. However, imputed 3 additional studies with positive effect sizes to adjust for potential publication bias, suggested 0.28, 95% CI, 0.14, 0.42. The likely impact of publication bias was considered trivial. Processing speed. Processing speed was assessed as a FAR transfer measure in 22 studies, which included a total of 795 participants in intervention conditions, sample size 36.14, SD 48.69, and 705 participants in control conditions, sample size 32.05, SD 48.43. The mean effect size did not reach signified. CANT, G0.18, 95% CI, 0.01, 0.37, p.058, though there was significant moderate heterogeneity between studies, Q, 21, 58.71, p.001, I264.23%. The funnel plot showed considerable asymmetry toward the right side of the mean, 2.46, SE 0.71, p.003. Notably, after imputation of 5 studies with positive effect sizes, the mean effect size for processing speed outcomes adjusted for potential publication bias was small and significant, adjusted 0.35, 95% CI, 0.17, 0.52. This adjusted effect size may reflect substantial impact of publication bias. Visuospatial ability. 5 studies included a measure of visuospatial ability, totaling 161 participants in an intervention group, sample size 32.20, SD 19.66, and 123 in a control, sample size 24.60, SD 18.72. The mean effect size was small and significant, G 0.37, 95% CI, 0.08, 0.66, p.012. Heterogeneity was non-significant between studies, Q, 4. 5.36, p.253, I2 25.34%. Egger's test indicated that the studies were distributed symmetrically within the funnel plot, 1.32, SE 1.97, p.550. The trim and fill analysis imputed 2 studies with positive effect sizes of low precision to balance out the funnel plot. This adjusted training effect was significant and moderate in size, adjusted 0.50, 95% CI, 0.21, 0.80. However, this adjusted effect size should be interpreted with caution as publication bias detection methods can yield unreliable estimates for analyses comprising a small number of studies, Ornstein et al., 2009. Long-term efficacy, pretest to follow-up. Maintenance of trained outcomes. 8 studies measured trained outcomes at a follow-up testing occasion, see Figure 5. Between these studies, 191 participants were included in an intervention group, sample size 23.88, SD 16.75, and 133 in a control group, sample size 16.63, SD 3.54. On average, follow-up testing occurred 10 months after post-test, ranging from 4 to 18 months. The mean effect size for trained outcomes from pretest to follow-up was significant and large, G 0.85, 95% CI, 0.40, 1.29, p.001, with significant moderate heterogeneity between studies, Q, 7, 23.24, p.002, I 269.88%. The funnel plot did not indicate any evidence of publication bias, 6.74, SE 4.83, p.213, and no studies were imputed in the trim and fill analysis. After examining the same 8 studies in an analysis examining immediate efficacy, pre-post, a slightly larger mean effect size was observed, G 0.89, p.001. Maintenance of near transfer outcomes. A total of 16 studies included a near transfer measure at follow-up, with 520 participants included in an intervention group, sample size 32.46. Figure 5. Forest plot displaying individual and summary effect size estimates for trained outcomes from pre-test to follow-up, long-term efficacy. This document is copyrighted by the American Psychological Association or one of its allied publishers. This article is intended solely for the personal use of the individual user and is not to be disseminated broadly. Efficacy of executive functions training 17. SD 48.06 and 458 in a control group. Sample size 28.60, SD 47.09. On average, follow-up testing occurred 7 months after post-test, ranging from 3 weeks to 18 months. Figure 6 illustrates the forest plot of Coriac CCT efficacy for near transfer outcomes from pre-test to follow-up. The mean effect size was small and significant, G 0.25, 95% CI, 0.06, 0.44, p.009. There was significant, low heterogeneity between studies, Q, 15, 25.27, p.046, I 240.65%. Visual inspection of the funnel plot indicated asymmetry toward the right side of the mean, though Egger's test was not significant, 0.03, SE 0.73, p.969. The trim and fill analysis imputed 4 studies with positive effect sizes of low precision, adjusted 0.40, 95% CI, 0.21, 0.59. The likely impact of publication bias was modest. When examining immediate efficacy of the same 16 studies, G0.26, P.017, the mean effect size was slightly larger than that for long-term FEKC. Maintenance of FAR transfer outcomes. FAR transfer tasks were measured at follow-up in 13 studies. Between these studies, 451 participants took part in an intervention, sample size 34.71, SD 53.26, and 412 were part of a control group, sample size 31.69, SD 52.14. On average, follow-up testing occurred 8 months after post-test, ranging from 1 to 18 months. The mean effect size was small and significant, G0.25, 95% CI, 0.11, 0.38, P.001. No significant heterogeneity was evident, Q11, 5.86, P.883, I20%. See Figure 7 for a forest plot displaying individual and summary effect sizes for FAR transfer outcomes from pre-test to follow-up. The funnel plot showed significant asymmetry toward the right of the mean, 1.11, SE 0.33, P.006, and the trim and fill analysis imputed 6 studies with positive effect sizes of low precision, suggested 0.33, 95% CI, 0.21, 0.45. The likely impact of bias was considered trivial. For the same 13 studies, the mean effect size for immediate efficacy, G0.35, P.001, was larger than the mean effect size. For long-term efficacy discussion, this meta-analytic investigation aims to explore the efficacy of CCT interventions targeting at least one core F, cognitive flex ability, inhibition, or WM, in improving cognitive performance among older adults. Immediate efficacy, pre-test to post-test, and long-term efficacy, pre-test to follow-up, were examined across 64 studies. This study also sought to elucidate any moderating factors of intervention efficacy with respect to different aspects of training conditions and study design. The findings from this meta-analysis yield important theoretical and practical implications for cognitive aging research. Summary of evidence. Results from the analyses examining immediate efficacy indicated that CORIEF CCT groups generally demonstrated larger improvements than control groups on a variety of cognitive domains at all levels of transfer. A significant, large training effect was observed for trained outcomes, and a significant, small training effect was observed for overall near-transfer outcomes. A significant, small training effect was also observed for overall FAR transfer outcomes. However, when analyzed in more detail, train-ING effects were significant for some individual cognitive domains, but not others. Significant training gains were observed for the FAR transfer domains of executive functioning, memory, and visual-spatial ability from pre-test to post-test. The FAR transfer effect on fluid intelligence was significant before, but not after adjusting for publication bias. No significant effects were observed on measures of attention or processing speed, though the training effect on processing speed might be underestimated due to publication bias. Refer to Table 2 for all effect sizes concerning immediate efficacy. Age of mean sample and type of training moderated CCT efficacy in promoting FAR transfer, overall, outcomes, indicating that larger improvements were observed for older compared to younger samples of older adults, and multi-domain training compared to single-domain training. Additionally, although the formal moderator statistics were non-significant, adaptive training studies consistently yielded significant training effects across trained, near-transfer, and FAR transfer outcomes, whereas non-adaptive training studies did not. Analyses examining long-term efficacy revealed a significant, large mean effect size for the maintenance of trained outcomes. Figure 6. Forest plot displaying individual and summary effect size estimates for near-transfer outcomes from pre-test to follow-up, long-term efficacy. This document is copyrighted by the American Psychological Association or one of its allied publishers. This article is intended solely for the personal use of the individual user and is not to be disseminated broadly. 18 Wynn, Murphy, and Andrews. And significant, small mean effect sizes for the maintenance of near-transfer and FAR transfer outcomes. When examining data from the same studies for immediate and long-term efficacy, the mean effect sizes for immediate efficacy were comparable with the mean effect sizes for long-term efficacy. From the analyses conducted in this study, it is evident that CORIEF training promotes both immediate and long-term improvements in performance on many aspects of cognition among healthy older adults. Transfer distance. As one would expect, performance was greatly improved on trained tasks for the cognitive intervention conditions compared to control conditions which did not receive repeated practice on these tasks. This supports previous findings by Karbach and Verhagen, 2014, who also reported that EF training produced a large training effect for trained outcomes. A small but significant training effect was obtained for overall near transfer outcomes in the present study, G0.26. Further analysis revealed small and significant mean effect sizes for each EF domain. The size of this near transfer effect, however, differed from that reported by Karbach and Verhagen, 2014, who found a moderate effect size, G0.50. This disparity in effect sizes likely stems from the type of studies included in each meta-analysis. Although both meta-analyses investigated EF training studies, the current study also included multi-domain training interventions and not just single-domain EF training. Thus, it may be that single-domain training yields larger training effects for near transfer measures compared to multi-domain training, as focusing on and spending more time exercising one cognitive process may be more efficient in improving untrained tasks from that same cognitive domain. In contrast, by training a variety of different cognitive processes, performance on many cognitive domains would likely improve, though the improvement might be smaller than if only one cognitive process were trained due to less time spent training on each domain. In accordance with this notion, findings from this meta-analysis revealed that single-domain trained ING studies obtained a larger effect size than multi-domain studies on near transfer outcomes, but multi-domain training obtained larger effect sizes for overall far transfer and most individual cognitive domains, see Table 2. Lastly, small, significant effect sizes were found for overall far transfer in the current study and by Karbach and Verhagen. 2014, as core EFS are required to execute other cognitive processes and perform everyday activities, Diamond, 2013, it is not surprising that improvements in EFs generalized to gains in other cognitive domains as well, Karbach and Frey, 2016. However, this conclusion should be interpreted with careful consideration as this overall far transfer analysis included training effects from a variety of cognitive domains, some of which likely share a higher degree of underlying commonalities with EFs than others, e.g., STM might be more closely linked to EFs than fluid intelligence. Thus, conclusions of far transfer need also take into account the training effects for each individual far transfer cognitive domain, presented in the next section. Individual cognitive domains. The present meta-analysis OB serves small, significant training effect sizes on outcome measures of executive functioning, fluid intelligence, memory, and VISU. A spatial ability, but not attention or processing speed. Findings 4. Fluid intelligence and processing speed needs to be taken with caution, however, as the statistical significance of these analyses change after accounting for publication bias. The findings from this study are similar to that of a recent meta-analysis conducted by Lampet et al., 2014, who examined the efficacy of single-domain and multi-domain CCT interventions in healthy older adults, though interventions were not restricted to EF training. These authors reported small, significant effect sizes for overall cognition, verbal memory, nonverbal memory, WM, processing speed, and visuospatial skills. No significant training EF effects were reported for attention or executive functioning. Similar to Lampet et al., 2014, analyses for the domain of language were not performed in this study due to the limited number of studies that included a language outcome. Additionally, it is surprising that both meta-analyses did not find significant effect sizes reflecting transfer to the domain of attention, despite its association with EF, Diamond, 2013, and despite the inclusion of numerous CCT interventions targeting attention in Lampet et al. S. 2014 meta-analysis. It is possible that CCT is not as effective in improving attention compared to other cognitive domains, or perhaps CCT improves different facets of attention that are not consistently tested by transfer tasks. For instance, due to the overlap between selective attention and inhibitory control, Diamond, 2013, core EF training might improve performance on Figure 7. Forest plot displaying individual and summary effect size estimates for far transfer outcomes from pre-test to follow-up, long-term efficacy. This document is copyrighted by the American Psychological Association or one of its allied publishers. This article is intended solely for the personal use of the individual user and is not to be disseminated broadly. Efficacy of executive functions training 19. Measures of this type of attention more than others, e.g., divided attention, focused attention. This type of analysis would currently be difficult to conduct due to the limited number of relevant studies within the literature that include outcome measures of attention. Breaking down analyses of attention into different facets would further limit the number of studies within each analysis, and consequently, any results yielded from such analyses would likely be unreliable. Further investigations are therefore needed before reaching a conclusion regarding CCT efficacy in improving attend time. As noted above, although a significant training effect was evident for the domain of fluid intelligence, This effect appeared to reflect considerable publication bias, as the unbiased effect size estimate was non-significant. Further, studies including a passive control group produced a significant training effect for fluid intel. Lightens outcomes, whereas studies including active control groups showed a non-significant, near zero effect size, see Table 2, potentially reflecting placebo effects, Doherty, Hamovitz, and Tidwell, 2016. Therefore, a definitive conclusion regarding improvements to fluid intelligence cannot be drawn based on this analysis, and the findings for this cognitive domain should be taken with caution. Further studies employing stronger methodology, e.g., active control groups, are warranted to provide more conclusive evidence about the efficacy of CORI-CCT in improving fluid intelligence. Compared to Lampert et al., 2014, the present study found a significant training effect for executive functioning. Tasks may assure ing global executive functioning or an untrained EF domain, but not for processing speed, though the unbiased effect size estimate for processing speed was significant. Further investigation is required before a conclusion can be made regarding the efficacy of CORI-CCT in improving processing speed. Disparities in find. Ings likely stemmed from the studies included in both meta-analyses. As the current meta-analysis examined studies targeting EFs, it is not surprising that findings reflected transfer to executive functioning, though it should be noted that this finding was driven by significant improvements in global executive function ing and WM outcome measures. Improvements were not observed for far transfer measures of cognitive flexibility or inhibition. In comparison, Lampert et al., 2014, included numerous CCT studies targeting speed of processing, which would likely have produced an effect size estimate reflecting improvements in the domain of processing speed. In addition, Lampert et al., 2014, did not separate outcome measures by transfer distance, thereby including a combination of trained, near transfer, and far transfer measures in each analysis. Including trained outcomes in their analyses might have inflated the effect sizes to some extent. Accordingly, moderate and high heterogeneity statistics were reported for many of their analyses. This between groups variance might potentially be explained through subgroup analyses examining transfer distance. As demonstrated in the current study and by Karbach and Verhagen, 2014, cognitive training typically yields large effect sizes for trained outcomes. Thus, it is critical for meta-analyses examining CCT efficacy to be stratified based on transfer distance, or at the very least, separate analyses should be conducted for trained outcomes to provide more accurate effect size estimates of intervention efficacy. Moderators of CCT efficacy. No variables consistently mod-erect CCT efficacy across all levels of transfer. However, training type significantly moderated the training effect for far transfer outcomes overall, indicating that multi-domain training studies produced significantly larger effect sizes than single-domain trained ing studies. As both single-domain and multi-domain EF training produced significant effect sizes across each transfer distance, exploratory analyses were conducted to further examine whether any specific types of training appeared to be most effective. These analyses revealed that only the multi-cognitive and video game training studies, both multi-domain interventions, consistently produced significant training effects across all levels of transfer, Bonferroni corrections applied. This is not surprising, as multi-domain interventions exercise numerous cognitive processes and activate a more widespread neural circuitry, Dye et al., 2016, which increases the likelihood of eliciting shared activation with a broader range of transfer tasks. Generally, slightly larger effect sizes were produced by video game training compared to multi-cognitive training, see Table 2. This may suggest that, compared to training on laboratory tasks, gamified training programs possibly engage different neural mechanisms or elicit different behavioral outcomes, e.g., higher levels of engagement or motivation, which further promotes cognitive transfer. However, it should be noted that this speculation was based on a limited number of studies, and the differences in effect sizes were rather small and not consistent across the different outcomes and cognitive domains. Additionally, the video game training group in the current study included both action video games, e.g., Rise of Nations, and non-action brain training programs, e.g., Lumosity. Although previous studies have found no difference in transfer effects between action and non-action video games, e.g., Boot et al., 2013, Torrio, Reels, and Ballesteros, 2014. Very few have compared video game training with traditional cognitive training. This is an area that requires further investigation. Age of mean sample was also a significant moderator for overall far transfer outcomes, indicating that samples encompass ing older participants demonstrated larger transfer effects than those comprising younger participants. This is in line with the findings from a video game training meta-analysis conducted by Torrio et al., 2014, who found that samples of older participants, 71 to 80 years, benefited more from training than samples from pre-ING younger participants, 60 to 70 years. The authors suggested that, compared to their younger counterparts, older participants likely begin training interventions with poorer cognitive functions and therefore have more potential to improve, thereby exhibiting greater improvements after training. However, these findings should be interpreted with caution as these analyses were based on the average age of the sample in each study, not the age of individual participants. Thus, it is possible that the average age of some samples was inflated or diminished due to a small number of much older or much younger participants. Nevertheless, these findings indicate that age is an important factor to consider when examining cognitive transfer and should be explored at the level of the individual. This would offer valuable insight into the individual differences of learning and cognitive plasticity. Further, although the formal moderator statistics were not significant, adaptive training produced significant training effects across all levels of transfer, whereas non-adaptive training did not. This document is copyrighted by the American Psychological Association or one of its allied publishers. This article is intended solely for the personal use of the individual user and is not to be disseminated broadly. 20. Wing, Murphy, and Andrews. This supports the theoretical framework of cognitive plasticity posited by Lovejoy et al. 2010, who suggests that adaptive training is essential for improving cognitive and neural efficiency. They posit that improvements in cognitive performance can only occur when there is a modest mismatch between an individual's functional capacity, skill level, and experience demands, task requirements. This mismatch is provided by adaptive training, which continually adjusts task difficulty based on an individual's current skill level, thereby ensuring that the training is neither too easy nor too difficult for the individual to complete. As an individual improves on training tasks after repeated practice, the difficulty gradually increases to maintain a certain degree of challenge. Taken together, adaptive, multi-domain CCT interventions may make up an effective cognitive training program for improving cognitive performance in healthy older adults. Further research is required to evaluate this interpretation. Long-term efficacy. A novel contribution that this study provides for the area of cognitive training is an analysis of the long-term efficacy of CCT at each level of transfer. There was a significant, large effect of training gains from pre-test to follow-up for trained outcomes and significant, small effects of training gains for near transfer and far transfer outcomes. When comparing the effect sizes from the immediate efficacy, pre-test, post-test, and long-term efficacy analyses, pre-test follow-up, using the same studies, the effect size for immediate efficacy yielded slightly larger effect sizes than that for long-term efficacy across all three levels of transfer. However, the decreases in effect sizes across time were not substantial at any transfer level. Trained, pre-post 0.89 versus follow-up 0.85, near transfer, pre-post 0.26 versus follow-up 0.25, and far transfer, pre-post 0.35 versus follow-up 0.25. This suggests that improvements in cognitive performance as a function of CCT have the potential to be maintained after completing the intervention. Though, it should be noted that there was a larger decline in the long-term training gain for far transfer than the other levels, indicating fade-out effects in some studies within this analysis. This decline is somewhat consistent with previous meta-analyses reporting negligible maintenance of WM training gains, Melville-Lervac and Hume, 2013, Schweikofer et al., 2015. However, the long-term training gains were still significant in the current study. Additionally, only 16 out of the 64 different studies, 25%, included in this review examined performance at a follow-up testing occasion. These findings should therefore be taken with caution as long-term efficacy from the other 75% of studies was not considered. Researchers conducting future CCT studies are encouraged to measure long-term efficacy by including at least one follow-up testing occasion to help fill this gap in the literature. More detailed analyses of long-term efficacy should also evaluate the effective interval length between post-test and follow-up testing occasions. This will help inform researchers about the durability of training effects and the need for booster sessions, e.g., Ball et al., 2002, to prolong the benefits of cognitive training. Overall, the evidence from the studies included in this meta-analytic investigation suggests that CORIEX CCT interventions show promise in improving short-term and long-term cognitive performance in older adults. Quality of evidence. Bias and heterogeneity. The summary risk of bias for the studies included in this review was evenly distributed between high and low risk. Importantly, the key findings were consistent and did not differ between studies which were high or low risk only, or for all studies included. The majority of studies which were evaluated as high risk resulted from lack of outcome assessor blinding, though it is acknowledged that this procedure may be challenging to implement for reasons such as practicality, timing, and funding. This source of bias has the potential to substantially impact the results of a CCT study, as researchers may consciously or subconsciously give hints or extra encouragement to participants known to be assigned to an intervention condition. As such, these participants might perform or behave differently in the presence of the researcher compared to a blinded outcome assessor. Researchers are encouraged to take this into consideration when designing their CCT studies and methodologies. If full blinding cannot be achieved, other methods may be implemented to minimize the potential for bias and demonstrate that this source of bias was considered and addressed. For example, a random subset of participants could be assigned to a blinded outcome assessor, or, with participants' consent, the administration of outcome assessments could be video recorded and rated by an independent viewer, or viewers, in terms of similarities and differences between administration for intervention and control participants. Overall, however, the quality of studies included in this review was sound. Heterogeneity between studies was low and non-significant for most analyses. Moderate heterogeneity was observed for trained, pre-post, follow-up, and processing speed analyses. Some of this variability might be explained through subgroup analyses examining different types of training, though these were not conducted due to limited sample size. Nevertheless, the findings do suggest that core EF training promotes short and long-term cognitive improvements. Significant publication bias was evident in the analysis concerned IMG attention outcomes, suggesting that if all relevant studies had been included, the effect size would have been negative, i.e., control groups showed larger improvements than training groups. Evidence of publication bias was also apparent within the process IMG speed analysis, indicating that the unbiased effect size estimate was significant. In contrast, the unbiased effect size estimate for fluid intelligence was non-significant. Methodological limitations. Potential biases were contained as much as possible, though this study is not without limitations. There is a plethora of studies that implement CCT interventions among the older adult population. However, this review was restricted to studies training core EFS. Including all types of CCT interventions was beyond the scope of this review, though it would be interesting to compare the efficacy of core EF training to other types of training, e.g., episodic memory training, speed of growth, setting training. This is a potential avenue for future research. Further, it is impossible to tease apart the effects of EF training from multi-domain interventions that also train a variety of other cognitive domains. Thus, it is difficult to discern whether it is, in fact, EF training that is promoting transfer effects, or whether it is a combination of EF training and other cognitive domains. Additionally, EFs have been found to be moderately correlated, Miyake. This document is copyrighted by the American Psychological Association or one of its allied publishers. This article is intended solely for the personal use of the individual user and is not to be disseminated broadly. Efficacy of Executive Functions Training 21. Et al., 2000, which upholds the conception that the three core EFS support one another and generally co-occur, Diamond, 2013. Thus, as core EFS are interrelated and are essential for carrying out everyday activities, training all three, compared to a single EF, has the potential to foster gains in a wide range of higher-order cognitive functions and promote gains in skills that have real-world applications. Further studies training all three EFs are therefore required to investigate this notion, in addition to a more specific analysis of data, e.g., separating multi-domain studies which include only core EFS from those which include EF and other cognitive domains. Although there is currently no consensus regarding the minimum number of studies required to perform a random effects meta-analysis, the Cochrane Handbook suggests that analyses comprising fewer than 10 studies may attain low power when conducting numerous statistical tests, Stern, Egger, and Macher. 2011. In accordance, some analyses may have been underpowered. Though, this was only the case for 2 out of the 13 analyses, visuospatial ability and follow-up trained tasks. Additionally, an analysis for language was not conducted due to the limited number of available studies examining this domain. All other analyses included at least 10 studies each. On a similar note, some motor aider analyses included an uneven number of studies in each subgroup, e.g., for type of training, there were many more WM, multi-cognitive, and video game studies than inhibition and cognitive flexibility studies. It is possible that this may have had an impact on the outcome of the moderator analyses. These findings should therefore be interpreted with caution. Future directions and implications. Although some types of training may not appear to be effective, the mixed outcomes in the current literature indicate that it would be premature to cease researching the benefits of cognitive train IMG. A constructive step forward would be to invest resources to further investigate the cognitive and neural mechanisms under the IMG cognitive training in order to develop a more comprehensive framework linking cognitive training transfer, and aging. This would, in turn, provide a strong theoretical foundation for future studies to investigate under what conditions might this type of training be effective, or how might this training be modified to increase its efficacy. Additionally, further investigation into the foundations of different cognitive constructs, such as executive functions, may also be required to gain a deeper understanding of cognitive functioning and development. These actions would aid in the development of effective interventions based on more defined and stronger fitting models of executive functions and general cognitive functioning. If there is any possibility for maintaining and improving cognition in later life, then this research is a worthwhile endeavor to discover the full potential that cognitive training has to offer. Katz et al., 2018. In particular, the cognitive domain of attention is a worthwhile candidate for further research and development. Performance in attention tasks did not improve as a function of CCT, as observed in the current meta-analysis and by Lampin et al., 2014. Thus, future studies may need to include different types of attentional outcome measures to establish whether CCT improves specific facets of attention, or alternatively, directly target attention within training programs. Other cognitive domains of interest for further research include language and visuospatial ability, as studies examining these domains were limited in number. Additional research is therefore warranted in order to more accurately determine the efficacy of CORIEX CCT in enhancing language and viscospatial skills among older adults. Critically, the majority of outcome measures assessed in the include studies for laboratory tasks and standardized tests. Although performance on some of these measures do predict success in real-world outcomes and abilities, it is not certain that improvements on transfer tasks will, in fact, translate into more efficient everyday functioning. Schmiedek, 2016. To this end, conclusions about whether CCT can improve general cognitive functioning would therefore be unfounded within this meta-analytic investigation. To address this issue, researchers are encouraged to incorporate real-world outcomes, e.g., driving ability, medication adherence, or more ecology. Cali-valid tasks, e.g., timed instrumental activities of daily living. Owsley, Sloan, McGuinn, Jr., and Ball, 2002, in future studies. Additionally, more research is required to determine whether pure EF training promotes cognitive improvements or whether it is a combination of training for EFS and other cognitive domains. Following the direction of Binder et al., 2016, it may also be fruitful for future studies to compare the efficacy of multi-domain training and single-domain training programs. Moreover, it may be the case that some participants do demonstrate large training and transfer gains, but these effects are masked by analyses based on group means. Karbach, 2014. Exploration of individual differences, such as baseline performance, should also be considered in future studies to progress the understanding of whether certain individuals benefit more from training than others. 2 AC counts have been proposed to explain potential individual differences. The magnification account suggests that high-performing individuals will benefit most from training due to already efficient cognitive processes, whereas the compensation account suggests that low-performing individuals will benefit most as they have more room for improvement than those already performing at a high level, e.g., Lupton, Bremer, Lee, and Lindenberger, 2012. For example, Karbach, Conan, and Spengler, 2017, administered a task-switching training intervention to children, young adults, and older adults. These authors observed a compensation effect, whereby individuals who performed worse at baseline, pre-test, children and older adults in particular, showed the largest improvements at post-test, i.e., larger training and transfer gains, compared to those who had already demonstrated efficient performance at baseline, mostly young adults. In contrast, Lupton et al., 2012, observed a magnification effect after implement ING as strategy-based memory training intervention among younger children, younger adults, and older adults. These authors found that, compared to all other age groups, baseline NEA ORI performance was highest in younger adults, who also exhibited the largest training gains. Thus, if certain individuals benefit more from specific types of training, interventions can start to be developed and targeted to suit different people. Researchers are also encouraged to include active control groups in their study design in order to control for non-focal effects such as expectancy to improve, social contact with the researchers, and general cognitive stimulation. This would allow for more accurate comparisons between intervention and control groups and provide stronger evidence regarding the efficacy of CCT interventions. Many studies in this field of research tend to focus on the question, does cognitive training work? Katz et al., 2018. This question has. This document is copyrighted by the American Psychological Association or one of its allied publishers. This article is intended solely for the personal use of the individual user and is not to be disseminated broadly. 22 Nguyen, Murphy, and Andrews. been explored using different types of cognitive interventions among different populations, though the verdict remains inconclusive. The limited scope of this question and the mixed conclusions from numerous meta-analyses, e.g., O et al., 2015, Karbach and Verhagen, 2014, Lambert et al., 2014, Melgalerberg and Hume, 2016, Schweighofer et al., 2015, Terrell et al., 2014, may be fueling the ongoing debate on this topic, doing little to further this area of research and progress toward a more thorough understanding of cognitive training. Rather, more attention needs to be placed on investigating the mechanisms underlying transfer effects in order to establish the optimal training conditions that elicit consistent broad transfer, and explore whether some types of training are more beneficial for particular individuals. Jaggi, Karbach, and Sturbach, 2017. Instead of producing an endless cycle of replications, researchers need to synthesize information from previous studies and meta-analyses to improve methodology, provide stronger empirical evidence, and advance this area of research by taking a step forward in the right direction and answering the right questions. Katz et al., 2018. Conclusion. This meta-analytic investigation explored the immediate and long-term efficacy of CORIEF-CCT interventions in improving cognition among older adults. CCT targeting CORIEF-S yielded small but significant gains to untrained tasks from a variety of cognitive domains. Gains in cognitive ability appear to be maintained at follow-up. Overall, the findings from this study suggest that using CORIEF-CCT to improve cognition in older adults is a worthwhile pursuit. Further high-quality studies are warranted to build upon this emerging area of research and to provide stronger empirical evidence regarding the efficacy of CORIEF-CCT. From here, focus needs to be placed on identifying the optimal training conditions that promote improvements in performance on real-world outcomes to help foster mental health and well-being in later life. References. References marked with an asterisk indicate studies included in the quantitative review and meta-analyses. Adrian, J. Postel, V. Mosinger, M. Rassel, N. and Charles.